homeschooling is so much more accessible to families. So whether it's that a family doesn't want that kind of full-time commitment of homeschooling, or maybe both parents have to work and it's difficult to manage that in homeschool. I think now what we're seeing is a lot of these micro schools and learning centers and homeschooling collaboratives running, in some cases, up to 5 days a week as full drop-off programs at a fraction of the cost of any kind of traditional private school. In states with robust school choice policies, these programs are often tuition-free. And so they provide an opportunity for families who like the idea, the sort of freedom and flexibility that homeschooling provides, that opportunity to customize curriculum according to, again, your own values and viewpoints and a child's individual learning needs. All of that is appealing to parents, but maybe they can't sort of approach homeschooling in the conventional way. If it's conventional, they can't necessarily have a parent.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. We're here at the State Policy Network annual meeting, where leaders from across the country come together to talk about freedom, limited government, and local solutions. SPN helps state groups put those ideas into action, and what's great is we get to meet them face to face. And in this episode, we're going to talk about education, because it has changed a lot over the past few years. More families are looking beyond the traditional classroom, whether it's homeschooling, micro schools, or other creative approaches, to find something that really works for their kids. And today's guest has been right in the middle of that conversation. She's written and spoken for years about thinking and rethinking how kids learn. And she's got a brand new book out called Joyful Learning that takes those ideas even further. She also hosts a podcast where she brings on guests who are actually building these new models of learning. I want to welcome to the podcast Kerry McDonald, who is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, where she leads the Education Entrepreneurship Lab and hosts the Liberated, I always get that wrong, podcast. She's also the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at the State Policy Network and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Kerry, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's so great to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
So much fun for having you here.
Yeah.
So, you spent your career, like you said, rethinking education and figuring out what are the best ways that kids can learn. What in the first place, drew you to study that, to dedicate your life to education?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it was really from studying economics. I was an economics major as an undergraduate back in the late 1990s. Fell in love with economics. And it was through the lens of economics that I started to wonder, why is it that we have so much choice, variety, and abundance in all other areas of our lives, but in K-12 education, we didn't have that choice and variety and abundance. And the more I sort of probed, I realized, that has a lot to do with the fact that we largely have a government monopoly in K-12 schooling. And certainly even more then than now, most American students are attending an assigned district school. So that made me more and more curious about education, education policy. I was also becoming interested in alternative forms of education. It was the first time I ever met a homeschooling family was when I was an undergraduate, and that blew my mind because I had never known anything about homeschooling, had never met a homeschooler until then. So all of that was sort of coalescing and led me to graduate school in education policy at Harvard. At the time, if you were interested in anything to do with education choice or innovation, the only place for you really was in the charter sector. So I became interested in charter schools and worked for a little bit while in graduate school with the Pioneer Institute, the SPN affiliate free market think tank in Massachusetts, which was at the time really a forefronter and still is in the charter sector, helping to incubate new charter schools. But I still kept thinking that there was something beyond charter schools. What else is there beyond a traditional classroom? And it wasn't until several years later when I became a mom and started thinking about education options for my own kids that my husband and I decided we would homeschool them. And then that sort of opened up a whole new perspective on learning outside of a conventional classroom. And that's where, again, much of my writing and work has been for over a decade now.
Yeah. So I first want to hear about, like, it becomes really personal, your education decisions, when you're like, okay, I'm putting my kids' future on the line here by the education decisions I make for my kids. And, you and I know one another, and, we homeschool our 11 kids. And at the very beginning, at the time, my wife, who had been homeschooled herself, said to me, hey, I don't know if we want to homeschool. It's up to you, kind of. I was like, really? Come on. That doesn't seem fair. I'm the new guy. I went through all public school, but I got excited about it.
Yeah.
But there's a risk there, it feels like. I mean, how did you feel about when you made that decision to do something out of the norm to educate your own kids?
Yeah, at the time, so we live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And, as my oldest was sort of approaching school age, I was looking at all of the things we were able to take advantage of in the city, and all of these, museums and libraries and cultural events and historic sites. And we were going to, at the time, homeschool park days, even before she reached school age. And I remember thinking that if she went to kindergarten, her world would contract.
Yeah.
Because here we had this expansive city and all of these sort of people, places, and things around us to explore. And if she went to a kindergarten classroom, she would be in a large classroom in the city with, this sort of age-segregated group of students, the same group of students, and the same kind of static handful of teachers enclosed within a building all day. And, I said, well, let's just hold off on that and let her explore and continue to develop her interest. She had already taught herself to read. So, there's so much learning already happening that we just kind of took it year by year and really fell in love with the homeschooling lifestyle and the ability to kind of follow our children's lead and watch their true potential sort of emerge. And now my oldest, who I'm talking about there, just went off to college. We just moved her in to her freshman year dorm last weekend. So it's worked out well. And she was homeschooled all the way through.
Nice.
Yeah.
And she can read.
And
Who
she
knew?
can read. Not even that. She's a math major in college.
That's great.
Yeah.
I was joking. So my parents were in education. My mom was a high school teacher. And I think, she'd never say this, but I think she didn't believe our kids would be literate at a certain age when we decided to homeschool. But it's been cool to watch them kind of go, in her case, maybe begrudgingly, be like, well, all right, they seem pretty well adjusted. They seem that, they're not making their own clothes at home. Although I wish we did, by the way, that'd be pretty cool. But a great learning experience. But, there's so many stereotypes out there about homeschool families that just don't fit what it is, because so many, at least what I find, is a lot of homeschool kids are very comfortable with multiple age ranges, talking to adults. They're not just in that strata of their, a year above them and below them. And I think it really equips them well for life. And they just tend to be interesting people too. But I mean, there are a lot of misconceptions out there still about homeschool kids and families. Yeah,
although, I think you probably see this too, David, in your work. I think those misconceptions are really changing. I think that particularly this younger cohort of parents, this younger generation of parents with young children, they're much more receptive to homeschooling and microschools and other sort of alternatives to a conventional classroom. I was able to talk to a lot of these, younger millennials and older Gen Zers with kids for research around my new book. And I heard from them over and over that they said, schooling hasn't changed much since they were in school, and yet so much of society has changed, all of these technological innovations and personalization that we now enjoy in the rest of our lives. And I think these younger parents were thinking, why isn't schooling catching up? Why is there this conventional classroom that doesn't seem innovative and isn't reflective of what else we have around us? So I'm hearing more and more of these parents foregoing conventional schooling from the get-go. Even before their kids reach school age, they've decided that they want to explore microschool in their community, or want to think about a homeschooling collaborative in some way, or choose something different than a traditional classroom.
Well, take me now. You talked about, you've been in the kind of education freedom movement for 25 years, potentially, started when you're 15. How have you seen, you've been involved in it. You had a ringside seat there. I know that it's really grown and picked up speed. I mean, talk to us about how what that's looked like, that progression.
Yeah, so my 2019 book, Unschooled, really talked about the growth and diversification of the homeschooling movement and the emerging microschooling movement. And of course, come 2020, that exploded. I mean, more and more families kind of got a glimpse of what was happening in their children's classrooms through pandemic era Zoom schooling, and they were frustrated at prolonged school closures. And I think that many of these parents sort of poked their heads up to see what else was out there when their local school was shut down. And then they discovered this whole world of homeschooling and microschooling and alternatives to conventional schooling that they didn't know about before then. And they became more and more interested in these models. Many of them actually built new models. So we started the rise of the pandemic pod in the summer of 2020 with these spontaneous groups of parents getting together to create learning communities when the local schools were shut down. And many of those pandemic pods evolved into full-fledged microschools in the coming years. And then I think also parents began to wonder, even after schools reopened for in-person learning, what else might be available for their kids. And at that time, more and more entrepreneurial parents and teachers were building these new schools and spaces. In fact, the vast majority of the founders who are profiled in Joyful Learning are former public school teachers, many of whom left the classroom around the COVID time because they were frustrated with what they were seeing in a conventional classroom. And they felt like this was an opportunity to do school differently. So they built these new models. And we continue to see growth. Obviously, we're seeing declining enrollment in U.S. public schools that goes beyond predicted enrollment drops based on falling birth rates. And we see homeschooling rates continue to be quite high. In fact, Angela Watson, a professor at Johns Hopkins University who runs the homeschool hub there, has done some great research on this. And she reported in the fall of 2024 that in the 2023-2024 school year, homeschooling rates were higher in that school year than they were the previous year in 90% of the states that report homeschooling, and not all states do, but in the 90% of those that do report homeschooling, it was higher than in the 2022-23 school year. So this is well beyond COVID. Clearly this sort of sustained growth in homeschooling it's continuing, and more families are looking for, again, those alternatives to the traditional school.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the really exciting phenomenon is that lower income families are providing some of the most growth when we see growth in homeschooling. Like it's really taken hold, and people see like, hey, you got parents who see their kids in failing schools who have no alternative. Like they're in a state where maybe they can't afford to go to a private school, they don't have a program to take advantage of, and so they turn to homeschooling. They kind of band together and create these micro schools or these groups that really are supportive. And I think it's one of the amazing developments that's really catching on. Can you kind of characterize that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this movement around education, entrepreneurship, and innovation occurring all across the country, but it's accelerating in states with robust school choice programs, particularly universal school choice programs that apply to microschools and homeschooling collaboratives and other innovative models. I think about places like Arizona and Florida that are really the leaders in these microschools and learning pods, and families, low-income families who otherwise wouldn't have had any choices, now have these choices. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, that's leading to more and more families, more and more founders creating programs because they know they have families who can access these programs. So I think we can't underestimate the power of school choice policies, particularly universal choice policies that include these innovative models in accelerating education entrepreneurship and the supply of these innovative options for families. One of the founders I talk about in Joyful Learning is retired United States Air Force officer who taught in the Texas public schools for a number of years, then moved to Utah to work in the charter school sector there, but always wanted to create a different kind of school than what he was finding. And it was the passage of Utah's Universal Choice Program, its ESA program, that finally was the catalyst for him to launch Orchard STEM School in rural Santaquin County, Utah. That was, again, the kind of school he always dreamed of. And he said it was truly that ESA, that universal ESA, that was the motivation and the provided the opportunity for him to go ahead and do that. And now he wants to bring more of those types of schools, particularly to rural counties throughout Utah. So again, school choice is very much an accelerant over the past 5 years, as much as interest in school alternatives as well.
That's great. That's right. We're going to keep trying to pass transformational reforms.
So
we'll give more kids and more families those options. So you have your own podcast, Liberated.
Yeah.
What kind of guests do you have on? What do you talk about?
So, I had been writing about the alternative education movement and a lot of these trends around homeschooling and microschooling. As I said, even before 2020, I have a column at Forbes.com. I had been writing about these trends there. Then COVID hit, more and more interest in these models. So continue to write a multitude of articles. And in early 2022, I said, I love listening to podcasts. Why don't I start hosting a podcast and bring some of these founders, these parents and teachers creating these new schools and spaces on the show to share their founder stories. So the podcast launched in February of 2022 with the story of Jill Perez, who is a New Jersey public school teacher for over a decade, had more recently transferred into higher ed and was teaching student teachers in training at Seton Hall University when COVID hit and school shut down for her 4 kids. So she ended up homeschooling them, creating a pandemic pod that year, like so many other parents, never had any intention of homeschooling or thinking about an alternative to a traditional classroom. She loved it so much, and other families loved being a part of her pod so much that year that they begged her to continue even when schools reopened, which she did. And she ended up creating a full-fledged microschool called Tranquil Teachings Learning Center in Monmouth County, New Jersey, that continues to flourish today. And she, says it's one of the most rewarding things she's ever done. She's so thrilled to be an education entrepreneur. So stories like Jill's that I really wanted to provide a platform for others to hear. And within 6 months, the podcast started as a weekly podcast, but within 6 months, I had such a backlog of stories like Jill's that I boosted the podcast to twice a week. And now, over 300 episodes later, I still have a backlog. There's just so many stories to tell, and it's really exciting. Yeah.
That's right. Are there any other guests? Any favorite guests or favorite stories? Of course, I'm sure all your guests are your favorites, just like me. But any favorite stories that stand out?
So that was actually one of the reasons that I wrote Joyful Learning, is I wanted to provide other opportunities for these stories to be told. And I think what's really exciting about this overall movement in microschooling, in homeschooling, in sort of choice-enabled education options is the diversity of these models. And so, for example, Joyful Learning starts off with the stories, again, of 2 podcast guests. One, Coy Moorfield, who founded the Lab School of Memphis, kind of post-COVID. She was a former public school teacher who wanted to find a progressive microschool for her kids, more progressive, culturally relevant, something that she couldn't really find, didn't want to put her 4 kids into the public schools. And so she built what she couldn't find. And then in that same introduction, I talk about another founder in Tennessee, Rebecca Ellis in Chattanooga, who also was kind of dissatisfied with local private school options, didn't want to send her kids to public schools, was homeschooling some of her kids, and ended up creating a Charlotte Mason-inspired hybrid homeschool program. Nice. And so I think it shows sort of the diversity of these models, from faith-based to secular, from progressive to more conservative models, different kinds of educational philosophies and approaches. And so many families now are able to find just the right school or space for them that's aligned with their own individual preferences and needs.
Man, I just find this story so inspiring, and I'm just always amazed at the innovation that people engage in and how they get such great results. So I got to go back and listen to more and more of the episodes. Yeah. But from a podcaster, also an author, and before we talk about Joyful Learning, your current book, your original book, or at least your one from, you said, was 99.
Most recent, 2019.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Unschooled. What did that book deal with?
Yeah, so that book really told sort of my family's personal story of coming to homeschooling and self-directed education. That was sort of the foundation of the book, but it also talked about the growth in the homeschooling population, how homeschooling was and is much more reflective of the American population more broadly, demographically, geographically, ideologically. And it also talked about some of these early microschooling networks and these homeschool learning centers, some of which started back in the, early 1990s and of course have flourished, particularly in the last 5 years as more and more people realize that there is a way of doing education differently. So that book was really focused around kind of one educational philosophy, in particular self-directed education, which is the approach that my family chooses. But for Joyful Learning, I wanted to really capture this growing movement and momentum around alternatives to conventional schooling, much more broadly, capturing all kinds of different educational philosophies and approaches to show families what's really possible for their kids' education and to show founders that they can do it too. I mean, one of the most gratifying parts of my work is when I get emails or messages from listeners of the podcast who say, oh, I've been listening to your episodes and I heard so-and-so was a teacher, left the schools and opened a new school. And it's just given me so much motivation to go off and do it on my own. If they can do it, I can do it. And it's that kind of inspiration that I think is just so exciting.
I think that's so important. I mean, I can't tell you how many people, I even just talked to my general network. Now we're around a lot of homeschoolers just because we're that. Basically say without the other moms, the other family member who have done this before and kind of give them encouragement that, that if they felt alone, they wouldn't do it. I mean, I'll give you an example. I have a family member who is an elementary school teacher, had her kids, looked at us and said, well, I'll try homeschooling too after like a year or two. And after a year, gave it up. And it was just like, she was so used to the school mentality that it was hard for her to make that adjustment, but she was also just very nervous. And I think a lot of like her other family outside of us and friends just weren't supportive. They weren't a network there. And I felt like it kind of withered on the vine, and they had a good experience, going forward too, but they didn't homeschool. And I think that's a pretty common story. So I know that you know this from just talking to people all the time, but I kind of hope your book helps people see like, hey, there's a great pathway here. There's a lot of regular people from all kinds of life and all kinds of background doing great things in education with their kids.
Yeah, and not only that too, but that homeschooling is so much more accessible to families. So whether it's that a family doesn't want that kind of full-time commitment of homeschooling, or maybe both parents have to work and it's difficult to manage that in homeschool. I think now what we're seeing is a lot of these micro schools and learning centers and homeschooling collaboratives running, in some cases, up to 5 days a week as full drop-off programs at a fraction of the cost of any kind of traditional private school. In states with robust school choice policies, these programs are often tuition-free. And so they provide an opportunity for families who like the idea, the sort of freedom and flexibility that homeschooling provides, that opportunity to customize curriculum according to, again, your own values and viewpoints and a child's individual learning needs. All of that is appealing to parents, but maybe they can't sort of approach homeschooling in the conventional way. If it's conventional, they can't necessarily have a parent overseeing the curriculum at home. So they're able to now access these other spaces and still be able to have the benefits of homeschooling with some of the kind of daily structure that these micro schools offer.
Are there any stories from Joyful Learning that you think are most interesting or most inspiring?
There are so many stories.
It's like choosing amongst your kids.
There's over 50 founders featured in the book. I've already mentioned some of them. I think about Alicia Wright in Richmond, Virginia. She was a former public school teacher in the Virginia public schools, had moved to this particular area because of the strong schools and decided not to send her kids to those schools, ended up leaving the district to become a homeschooling mom for her 4 children, and then created a vibrant homeschool collective called Cultural Roots Homeschool Collective that now has over 100 students, K to 12. There's a micro school for the teens where they come 3 days a week. And then the other students, the K to 8ers, they have a couple times a week, they come for activities and lessons. And unlike kind of traditional homeschool co-ops, her program and others like hers that I profile, it's sort of outside experts, outside instructors who are doing a lot of the teaching, and they're thrilled to. She's found there's a lot of kind of community partnerships, people really eager to share their expertise and their knowledge in a classroom environment. So that's one example that's inspiring.
Well, what do you think the next evolution or the progression is in the homeschool community?
So the final chapter of Joyful Learning includes 5 trends where I think we're heading over the coming years, and I think we're going to continue to see the growth and expansion of homeschooling and microschooling. I think we're going to continue to see the growth and expansion of school choice policies, and there'll be a lot of synergy between those two. Because these homeschools and microschool programs will become more financially accessible to more families. More families will be eager to participate in them. There'll be more of these network effects where families realize they have options that they didn't know they had, and prospective founders realize they can create options that they didn't know were possible. So I think we're going to continue to see a snowballing effect as a result of the expansion of choice policies with education entrepreneurship. I think that we're going to continue to see AI and new technologies change education, in particular to focus more on learner agency and learner autonomy. I think AI tools have the potential to really encourage more student-driven learning in ways that sort of challenge the traditional top-down approach to education. I think that we'll continue to see flexible work arrangements, remote and hybrid work schedules seem here to stay. And because of that, families will start to desire freedom and flexibility for their children's education the way they desire that for themselves and their working experiences. And again, that's when microschools and other kinds of education options might feel more feasible and interesting to parents that might have more work flexibility. And then, I just think that we'll continue to just see the growth of alternatives to the traditional model. I think that we're seeing a move away from legacy institutions, sort of established institutions, and more of a desire for fresh upstarts in all parts of our lives, right? It's no surprise that YouTube has sort of outpaced, kind of legacy media for top views and content, because people want those individual content creators. They want personalized media, personalized entertainment. And I think we're going to see those same trends in education as well as we shift from the old to the new.
Well, I can't wait to see it and be part of it, truthfully. This is my family's life too. And I'm excited about it. I feel like an evangelist for homeschooling, and it's been a progression for me, but I love it. I'm so glad for the work that you're doing. And I think it's really important work. What's the best way for folks listening to this to find you?
Yeah, so the book is Joyful Learning, How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. It's available wherever books are sold. It was just published August 19th by Hachette, the large New York City publisher. And it's available, again, any bookstore or Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can follow my work at liberatedpodcast.com.
Fabulous. Well, I encourage everybody to get the book and listen to the podcast. So,
Thanks, David.
Kerry, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Folks, if you like this podcast and this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take it for granted. Go out there and defend freedom and liberty. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.